May it please the court, members of the jury. August 18th, 2013, 11:22 p.m. A quiet night is shattered by a frantic call to air traffic control. Zeke Fortenberry has lost power in his airplane. He needs to make an emergency landing, and he needs to make that landing quickly. Now Zeke's directed to a runway that gives him a shot at landing his plane. A runway with a lighting system that gives him a shot at making it home safely that night. But members of the jury, today we learned that those lights, they stayed dark when Zeke needed them most. That as Zeke clicked and clicked and clicked, he saw nothing. And today we learned why. We learned that the defendant's actions turned Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at safety, his last shot at hope, into nothing more than a shot in the dark. Members of the jury, at the beginning of today's trial, Ms. Hollingsworth came before you and explained that we represent Ms. Madeline Fortenberry. She told you that today you'd hear how Ms. Fortenberry's husband, Zeke, tragically lost his life on a dark, lonely night in August of 2013. She explained that today's case all boils down to two very important questions: whether the defendant was negligent in maintaining his runway, and if so, what role the defendant's negligence played in Zeke losing his life. Now, you alone, members of the jury, can answer those questions. My job as an attorney is to walk with you through the evidence we heard here today. Now, we all sat here for a good part of the afternoon listening to the witnesses testify, listening to the experts give their opinions, looking at the documents and the photographs that were entered into evidence. But now it's time to start answering those questions. What happened that night? Who is responsible for this crash? Who is responsible for this tragedy? Now, in determining, in reaching your decision here today, it's important that you understand exactly what you're deciding on, what the term negligence actually means, and why that term is so important here today. Now, as the judge will later instruct you, negligence is a failure to use ordinary care. A simple way of thinking about negligence is that a person can be negligent anytime they fail to do something we would expect a reasonable person to do. And as a result of those unreasonable actions, someone is injured, someone loses their life. I want you to keep that definition in mind as we talk about the defendant's actions, as we talk about what happened that night. Now, as we talk through the evidence, as we talk about the testimony, there are three things I want you to keep in mind. First, the defendant's failure to shoulder the responsibility he took on when he installed those lights. The defendant's failure to obtain the necessary repairs when he found out those lights weren't working. And the defendant's failure to spread the word those lights were out and that they couldn't be relied upon. Now, members of the jury, let's first talk about Mr. Thompson's responsibility. We call this his duty, the reason why he had to maintain those lights in a certain way. Now, we learned today that Mr. Thompson's runway was located on his private piece of property, that he was the sole owner of that property. Now, you may be asking yourselves why. If this runway was on his private land, why should he be responsible for maintaining it in a certain way? Why should he be responsible for following any rules or doing what the government tells him to do? Today we learned that there's a simple explanation. That when Mr. Thompson built this runway and put that lighting system on it, he accepted federal money to do so. When he took those federal funds, when he chose to receive those federal funds, he agreed to follow certain rules. And today we got to look at those rules. You're going to get to look at this document in the deliberation room. A document published by the U.S. Department of Transportation that tells the owner of runways, like Thomas Thompson, that they need to maintain and repair those systems. Today we learned that these rules applied to Mr. Thompson. He knew they applied to him, and that they're designed to keep pilots safe. Now, members of the jury, when Thomas Thompson chose to receive that federal money, when he agreed to follow those rules. He agreed to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining those lights. Take a time out real quick. I'm sorry.
Is that the new one?
That's a brand new one, so.
Yeah, it takes a while with those. You need to hold it down completely and let it soak in there. If that doesn't work, you actually can pull the piece out and turn it upside down. It works. But in every one that I've had. There we go.
Okay.
Wait, let me try one.
So
Okay.
I was dying.
But
But regardless, every marker you have, write something with it and then go up there.
Okay, we're good now. I'm sorry, y'all. That
It was
my
great
fault.
up until that point, Carmen.
Okay. When he accepted that federal money, when he chose to agree to those rules, he chose to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining those lights. Of maintaining those lights. Of following the rules that we just talked about. Now, members of the jury, today we've heard the word reasonable used over and over and over again. We heard the experts tell us what they think is reasonable. We heard Thomas Thompson take the stand and tell us that he really doesn't know what reasonable means. And that's okay. Because today, you are the only people that can tell us truly what is reasonable. What actions Thomas Thompson was reasonably expected to take in shouldering that responsibility, in following those rules, in maintaining that runway. Today we heard that there were two separate and distinct actions that Thomas Thompson could and should have taken when he found out those lights weren't working. Two actions that seem so simple to us here today, but that made the difference between life and death for Zeke Fortenberry. Now we first heard that Thomas Thompson, he could have gone out there and repaired those lights. Today we learned that he knew those lights weren't working on August 10th. That his friends had tried to land, and those lights, they simply couldn't be turned on. Now today the plaintiff called a witness, Mr. Sam Williams, who took the stand and told us exactly what was wrong with that system. Why those lights couldn't be activated. He told you that the radio receiver was broken. That it didn't matter what a pilot did in the cockpit of his plane, he wouldn't be able to turn on those lights. And most importantly, he told us how long it would have taken a person, a reasonable person, to fix that radio receiver. He told us that if Thomas Thompson had started that repair on August 10th, it could have been completed within 10 days. It should have been completed within 10 days. But members of the jury, we learned today that when August 18th rolled around, when over a week had passed from the time Mr. Thompson found out those lights weren't working, he had done nothing. And we tried to put all this stock in an email today. That's what defense counsel tried to do. They tried to convince you that an email from Thomas Thompson means that he escapes liability today. But what we learned is that that email, it never ordered anyone to do anything. The word fix was never used. The word repair was never used. What we learned is that the person he sent that email to did nothing. And by the time August 18th rolled around and Zeke Fortenberry needed those lights, they still could not be turned on. We learned that they couldn't be turned on because Thomas Thompson failed to obtain the necessary repairs when he first found out those lights weren't working. Now, today the defense called a witness before you to talk about that lighting system. Mr. Bates took the stand and tried to convince you that it could take upwards of a month to fix that radio receiver. But let's think about what Mr. Bates also told us. He told us that he's never worked with a pilot-activated lighting system like the one at South Fork Ranch, that he never went to South Fork Ranch himself to look at that runway, to look at those lights, to look at that radio receiver. Members of the jury, he told you it could take upwards of a month. But he never even looked at the system. He never looked at the radio. He couldn't take the stand today and tell us if the radio was simply unplugged, if a wire was loose, or if a dial had been turned in the wrong direction. Now, Mr. Bates might be a really smart man. He might know all about how airplanes work and they fly, but he simply cannot tell us reliably how long it would take to fix the pilot-activated lighting system. Now, members of the jury, even if you believe that Thomas Thompson couldn't obtain those repairs, that they were too complicated, that he didn't have the money to hire anyone, that he didn't have the means to go out there and fix those lights, we learned that there was a second action he could have taken. We learned that he could have called someone. He could have notified the FAA. He could have notified air traffic control. He could have spread the word those lights were out. Now, that just seems like common sense, ladies and gentlemen, that when you know something is broken and that people could be relying on it, you have to give some warning. Now, in a moment, Ms. Kluska is going to come before you, and she'll likely say that the rules we talked about, they don't mention calling the FAA. They don't mention calling air traffic control. And that's true. But that's where this definition of negligence that we talked about earlier becomes so important. Because nowhere in that definition does it say that a person is only negligent when they break a rule. Nowhere in that definition does it say a person is only negligent when they break the law. All that definition says is that a person can be negligent when they fail to use ordinary care, when they fail to act reasonably. Today we learned that it was reasonable for Mr. Thompson to spread the word those lights were out, to spread the word that those lights had stayed dark for 8 long days. Now, members of the jury, Zeke Fortenberry can't be here today to tell us what happened over South Fork Ranch. He can't be here to tell us what happened on that night. All we have left are his words. Words contained in a transcript of his last conversation with Alex Bell. A transcript that details the last moments of his life. Now, from that transcript, we learn that Zeke ran into engine trouble. His engine shut off on him, and he needed to find a runway. He needed to find a place to land. We learned that he was directed to South Fork Ranch and told it had a pilot-activated lighting system, that he could rely on those lights. Today we learned that he was given that information because Thomas Thompson failed to spread the word those lights were out. Because the defendant failed to spread the word that those lights couldn't be relied upon. Now we learned what happened when Zeke Fortenberry arrived at South Fork Ranch. We learned that he clicked and clicked and clicked his microphone, trying to get those lights on. We learned that he did everything the air traffic controller told him to do. But we learned that those lights stayed dark. That as he looked back and forth, he saw nothing. We learned today that no matter what Zeke Fortenberry did, those lights weren't coming on because Thomas Thompson failed to obtain the necessary repairs when he first found out they weren't working. When Thomas Thompson failed to spread the word those lights were out, when he failed to obtain the necessary repairs, members of the jury, he failed to shoulder the responsibility that he took on when he accepted federal money to install that lighting system. And this is what Zeke was left with. A distress call. A distress call just like the one that we learned about in that transcript. A call that should have allowed Zeke to get the information he needed to find a runway where he could land his plane. The information he needed to reach safety. But today we learned he was given the wrong information. He was told that those lights worked because the defendant failed to spread the word they were broken. We learned that he couldn't get those lights working because the defendant failed to obtain the necessary repairs. We learned that shortly after Zeke arrived at South Fork Ranch, he crashed his plane and lost his life. Because Thomas Thompson failed to shoulder the responsibility. Today we learned that the only lights that shone on South Fork Ranch that night were the lights of emergency workers pulling Zeke's body from the wreckage of his downed plane. This is what Zeke was left with that night. Darkness, a black night sky. And you got to look at what happened shortly after. You got to see a photograph of the plane crash. It didn't have to end this way, members of the jury. Zeke should be here today. The defendant should have spread the word those lights were out. He should have obtained the necessary repairs. He should have shouldered his responsibility. But when Thomas Thompson did nothing, when he failed to act, when he failed to speak up, when he failed to act reasonably, he turned Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at safety, his last shot at hope, into nothing more than a shot in the dark. Find Mr. Thompson liable for Zeke's death. Thank you.
Permission to set up the court hearing. May it please the court? His fate was sealed. Mr. Fortenberry sealed his own fate when he filled his plane, sealed that gas cap, and took off. He was going to crash before he even left Kansas City. You heard a lot today about the FAA and PAL systems. You learned just how complicated those types of systems can be. But the most important thing you learned is that fueling a plane, it isn't like fueling a car. You can't just pull off at the next exit and fill up when you're in a plane. You can't just pull off to the side of the road and call AAA. When you're flying a plane and you run out of fuel, you crash. And that's why we have the FAA. The FAA regulations tell us exactly what a pilot must do in order to ensure their own safety. The FAA regulations require that a pilot have enough fuel to first make it from point A to point B. Just make it to their destination. But they need an additional 45 minutes worth of fuel in order to be FAA compliant. They have to look at the appropriate weather source to also calculate winds into their fuel. And we learned today that, unfortunately, tragically, Zeke Fortenberry failed to follow those regulations. He failed to follow and failed to fuel his plane correctly. So when Zeke Fortenberry fueled his plane, he sealed his own fate before he even came close to the South Fork Ranch. Now we agree that Zeke Fortenberry's death is tragic. But the plaintiff would have you point fingers at everybody else without looking at Mr. Fortenberry's own involvement in his own crash. They would have you disregard half of the evidence that you saw today and instead lay the blame for this accident at Mr. Thompson's feet. But members of the jury, you learned today that that is not where the fault or the blame of this accident lies. That fault lies with the plaintiff and the plaintiff alone. Now we're going to walk through some of the evidence and the testimony that you saw here today. And when we do, I want you to keep just one very simple question in mind. Who in this case failed to act reasonably? And when you do, you will see that the only person who failed to act reasonably was Zeke Fortenberry. Now, we called Kim Bates for you to the stand today. Kim Bates is an expert in aeronautical engineering, and he investigates aircraft accidents for a living. He investigates what causes aircraft accidents. He got up on the stand today and told you that in this case, Mr. Thompson acted exactly as a reasonable person should. He told you that maintaining and repairing an airstrip like a PAL system can take 30 days or more. Why is that? Because the complicated parts for a PAL system aren't something that you just go to Home Depot and pick up. They take time. They take people with the expertise and the knowledge who know how to fix them. So when Mr. Thompson sent that email to his ranch manager who had a reputation for fixing everything for him, he did what he was supposed to do. And Mr. Bates told you that that's exactly what a reasonable person would have done under the same circumstances. Now, Mr. Bates told you about the fuel regulations, the FAA regulations. These regulations covered the flight that Mr. Fortenberry was taking that night. So let's talk about these regulations. The first thing that Mr. Fortenberry would have had to do in order to be FAA compliant would be to have enough fuel to travel first from point A to point B, and then have enough fuel to travel for an additional 45 minutes. These regulations also require that Mr. Fortenberry look at an appropriate weather source. So let's talk about some of the calculations that Mr. Fortenberry should have done that night. Let's figure out what Mr. Fortenberry would have had to do in order to make it to his destination and then be FAA compliant. Like I said already, the regulations require that Mr. Fortenberry have enough fuel to make it from point A to point B. In this case, Mr. Fortenberry was flying from Kansas City to Dallas. Now we know that that flight was 480 miles. We also know that the cruising speed of the Piper Cygnet, the plane that Mr. Fortenberry was flying that night, is 120 miles per gallon, or miles per hour, excuse me. So that means that Mr. Fortenberry had a 4-hour plane ride ahead of him that night. And let's assume for a minute that Mr. Fortenberry was encountering absolutely no wind on his trip. Let's assume while we do these calculations that Mr. Fortenberry was flying through the most blue skies with no wind in the air. And we know that that's not the case, members of the jury, but let's give Mr. Fortenberry the benefit of the doubt and try to figure out what he should have done in order to be FAA compliant. So, if Mr. Fortenberry was flying through absolutely no winds that night, the flight would have taken him 4 hours. Now we know with these calculations that means Mr. Fortenberry would have needed 40 gallons of fuel in order just to make it from point A to point B. But that's not all. It's obvious that a pilot needs enough fuel just to make it to their destination. But the regulations require that Mr. Fortenberry need an additional 45 minutes worth of fuel. Plaintiff's own expert got up on the stand today and told you how critical those additional 45 minutes are. He told you that is the safety net for pilots, and that pilots should do everything in their power to ensure that they have the most safe flight ahead of them. So he told you that this 45 minutes, it's really important. Now, based on these calculations, we know that an additional 45 minutes worth of fuel meant that Mr. Fortenberry would have needed an additional 7.5 gallons worth of fuel in order to have that 45 minutes. That means in total, Mr. Fortenberry would have needed 47.5 gallons of fuel in his plane in order to make it to Dallas and be FAA compliant. Members of the jury, his plane only held 45. That means that when Mr. Fortenberry was in Dallas, hadn't even taken off yet, hadn't even gotten to the South Fork Ranch, hadn't even made it to Lone Star, he was going to crash. Because he required more fuel than his plane could even hold. And Kim Bates told you she's not the only one who just thinks that Mr. Fortenberry ran out of fuel. The NTSB report told you that too. The NTSB report is the federal agency who's charged with investigating aircraft accidents. Now, you'll have a chance to look through this, but I want to just point out a few key points for you now. This report states that Mr. Fortenberry, his fuel lines were intact, but he didn't have enough fuel. This report also found that the carburetor was intact and contained no fuel. So, members of the jury, this crash wasn't due to the fact that Mr. Fortenberry's plane engine wasn't working or that the wings of his plane weren't working. This report tells us that Mr. Fortenberry crashed because he had insufficient fuel. But you don't have to just take Kim Bates' word for it. You don't have to just take the NTSB's word for it. You can look at the cold, hard calculations that tell us that Mr. Fortenberry was never going to make it to Dallas. Because when he sealed that fuel cap with the incorrect amount of fuel, he sealed his own fate. Now, the FAA regulations also require that Mr. Fortenberry look at an appropriate weather source. Kim Bates told us that an appropriate weather source, the most appropriate, is the NOAA report. Because the NOAA report tells us what the winds are going to be like thousands of feet in the air. It's the only weather report that tells us what the winds will be like at that altitude. The local weather doesn't tell us that. We've all seen local weather reports, and members of the jury, we're not concerned with what the winds would be like thousands of feet in the air. Zeke Fortenberry relied only on the local weather report to do these fuel calculations. And Kim Bates told us that wind is a very important thing to calculate in your fuel, to factor into your fuel calculations. Because if you're flying through a headwind, it can slow you down. If you're flying through a tailwind, it can speed you up. So knowing the weather that you're going to encounter is crucial. And the NOAA report tells us that. The local weather doesn't. That is not an appropriate weather source under the regulations. And if that's not bad enough, if the fact that Mr. Fortenberry did the incorrect calculations isn't bad enough, the fact that he looked at only the local weather isn't bad enough, he only looked at the local weather for Dallas. That means that he disregarded the 480-some miles of his trip before he reached his destination. The only thing that Mr. Fortenberry, the only benefit that he got from looking at that local weather report, is figuring out whether or not he would need a raincoat when he finally reached his destination. You learned today that the plaintiff, Mr. Fortenberry, was woefully ill-prepared for his flight. You heard from Sam Williams, the plaintiff's expert today. Sam Williams told you also how important those regulations are, calling them the safety net for pilots. Now, Sam Williams also told you that Mr. Fortenberry was an experienced pilot. But ask yourselves, is failing to do the appropriate calculations, failing to look at the appropriate weather report, does that sound like an experienced pilot to you? You also heard from Mr. Thompson himself. He got up on the stand and explained to you the actions that he took in order to maintain the airstrip. Now, the plaintiff is coming up with all these things that Mr. Thompson could have done to fix the airstrip. We could sit here all day, members of the jury, and think of a million things that he could have done. But that's not what the law requires us to do. In this courtroom here today, we are concerned with the facts and the law. So the law doesn't require us to answer the question of what could he have done. The law requires us to answer the question of what he should have done. And that advisory circular said that Mr. Thompson had the duty to maintain that airstrip as a reasonably prudent person, and that is exactly what he did. There's only one person that you heard about today that didn't follow the law, and that person, the person who disregarded the FAA regulations, that's Zeke Fortenberry. Now, in bringing this case before you today, the plaintiff bears the burden of proving to you that any alleged negligence by Mr. Thompson was the cause of Mr. Fortenberry's crash by a preponderance of the evidence. So let's break that down a little bit. Negligence just means failure to use ordinary care. Failure to do what a reasonable person would do under the same circumstances. Preponderance of the evidence means more likely than not. Now, let's talk about causation, though. They have to prove to you causation. And I want you to think of it like a chain. Picture the chain, or the causation that the plaintiff has to prove to you like a chain. And they have to show you that there are unbroken links of the chain from Mr. Thompson to Zeke Fortenberry's crash. Members of the jury, you heard today that's impossible. Because every time you heard about something that Mr. Fortenberry did wrong, it destroys a link in their chain. So when Mr. Fortenberry failed to check an appropriate weather source, it destroys a link. When Mr. Fortenberry failed to do the appropriate fuel calculations, it destroys a link. So the plaintiff cannot prove causation here for you today. Now, what about comparative negligence? Think of comparative negligence like a scale. Every time we heard that Zeke Fortenberry failed to do something that he should have done under the regulations, we can apportion a little bit of fault to Mr. Fortenberry. And if you find that Mr. Fortenberry was 51% or more at fault for his own accident, then you have to find Mr. Thompson not liable. Now, Mr. Fortenberry failed to do everything that pilots should do to ensure that they have a safe flight. Plaintiff's counsel told you that this case is about a shot in the dark. That Thomas Thompson left Mr. Fortenberry with only a shot in the dark. But you heard today that Zeke Fortenberry, he had several shots to ensure that he had a safe flight. And he missed every single one of them. Because he failed to do the appropriate calculations. He failed to check the appropriate weather. He failed to be FAA compliant. And so Mr. Fortenberry sealed his own fate. Don't seal the fate of Mr. Thompson for mistakes made by the plaintiff. Thank you.
Your Honor, may I inquire as to the time remaining for rebuttal?
You got plenty.
All right. Now, members of the jury, Ms. Kluska just came before you and tried to point a lot of fingers, shift the blame away from the defendant, to put it on anyone other than the defendant. Now, today, the defense's case merely rests on two important pieces of evidence. They've put their entire case on these two pieces of evidence. A weather report and FAA rules. Now, members of the jury, we heard a lot about this weather report here in court today. The witnesses told you that this report applied to Zeke's flight. The most important line on this report is right up at the top. You don't have to look far to find it. It says this flight was a VFR flight. Sam Williams told you what that means, that it was a flight in good visibility conditions. Now, today we looked at rules, and the defense just argued that Zeke Fortenberry was at fault, that he's the person responsible for this crash because he didn't follow these rules. But we learned that these rules, they only apply to IFR flights, that the requirements for fuel for the extra 45 minutes only apply to IFR flights. That this document, these rules, they simply do not apply to Zeke Fortenberry. Now, members of the jury, let's think about these calculations Ms. Kluska did before you when we take out those rules. Because what we learned today is they simply don't apply. We can get rid of this extra 45-minute requirement. We get rid of this additional 7.5 gallon requirement. And what are we left with? It would have taken him 40 gallons to reach his destination. His plane held 45 gallons. He had enough to reach his destination. He had enough when he took off to make it to Dallas. But today we learned that something else happened, that he ran into foul weather. Now, members of the jury, Ms. Kluska wants you to believe that Zeke Fortenberry could and should have looked at this report, that had he looked at this report, he would have been reasonable. But what we learned is that there's no way Zeke had access to this report. He simply didn't. This report wasn't published until 49 minutes after Zeke had left the ground. This document wasn't created until he was hundreds of miles into his flight. There was no way he had access to it. Now we have to ask ourselves why. Why the defense would bring these two documents in here. Rules that don't apply to Zeke Fortenberry and a forecast that he had no way of looking at. It's because the defendant wants to tell a particular story. He wants to weave a specific tale that distracts you from what really happened that night, that creates a smoke screen that he can hide behind, a smoke screen that his actions disappear into. But members of the jury, you're not going to let that happen today, because we saw through his distraction. We looked past the distractions that Ms. Kluska created. We saw that one man was to blame for this crash. It was a man who failed to spread the word those lights were out. A man who failed to obtain the necessary repairs. A man who failed to shoulder the responsibility he took on. When Mr. Thompson failed to act reasonably, he stamped a seal on Zeke Fortenberry's death certificate. His actions did that. Hold him liable for what he did that night, for stealing Zeke's life. Thank you.
Good job, guys.
Did you say stealing his life? Okay.
You finished at 72. You finished at 74.